So I'm going to start by just introducing our studies. And in fact, we're really going to present on preliminary results of 2 studies because they really do connect to each other. So we'll be jumping back and forth between the 2 of us. If I can learn to use the technology.
Is it on?
Yep. Do you have to go like this?
It's not on.
Oh, that's really helpful to turn it on. Pulling this. I thought you knew technology.
Oh. I don't know that kind of technology.
So we have a relatively large research group that's multi-university, and it's really exciting. We've been meeting for like 2 years, and it's really focused on motivation in urban schools with an emphasis on motivational factors in reading and literacy, and really focused on reading engagement. So we're going to show you a model of how that plays itself out. And we have members from 2 of the CSUs, Cal State Fullerton, Cal State Los Angeles, 1 UC Santa Barbara, and then Robert and I, in addition to a school district representative from Montebello Unified, and then several doctoral students that are on our team. And it's a really exciting team because we're all really passionate about reading motivation and engagement. And we really want to focus on urban children because a lot of work's been done on reading motivation, but really focused on struggling readers and English learners and learners in urban settings. It's somewhat lacking. So we are really trying to push this research agenda forward, and this is our first 2 research efforts in terms of real studies, right, Robert? So our concerns, research dimensions are related to researching dimensions of students' motivation for reading and discovering knowledge of motivation for reading and their application of that knowledge. You can see these are our real students. In fact, we're going to present one study today that actually involves all of our teacher candidates in the MAT program, which is really dramatic for the Rossier school because generally we don't do that with doctoral students, but not so much with the younger students. So, and here's an example of one real kid who was involved in one of our studies and a teacher candidate. So we have some goals of creating professional development programs that deepen teachers' knowledge of motivation for reading and its application in classrooms. And then we want to design child-related interventions to improve comprehension, particularly, like I mentioned previously, for urban students with diverse backgrounds, struggling readers, and second language learners. This is sort of the gap that as we begin to explore the literature on reading motivation and engagement, we identified this gap as being something very significant. We want to fill that gap with our research agenda. So a little bit about motivation, and I'm imagining, we have doctoral students in the room who've gone to our learning courses. Some of them are ed-psych doctoral students, so they've heard motivation, motivation, motivation. But we're going to talk about it a little bit today to give you some context. And motivation basically drives goal-directed behavior. And there's not one motivation theory, but many. And things like the indicators that we really focus on in motivation theory, often across theories, are active choice, persistence, and mental effort. Again, it's important to note that motivation is not a stable trait, it's not innate, it's not invariant, but rather it's a set of socio-culturally shaped dynamic beliefs about tasks, one's domain-specific ability, causes for success and failure. And those features are sensitive to social context. This is really important to note because people think of it as something that's static and that can't change and that it's not situation-specific. And that, in the research, we found, not just our research, but in exploring the literature, it really isn't static at all. It is something that's situation-specific. So in other words, you could have a high level of motivation in one area and not in another. So it's really important that you know that it's multidimensional, and sociocultural influences are critical to motivation. Our theoretical frame throughout our research is focused on sociocultural theory, so you'll see that play itself out in addition to motivation theory. Like I mentioned previously, cognitive aspects of reading and literacy are well researched. You can find lots and lots of studies in like Reading Research Quarterly, the scientific study of reading behavior, things like that, journals like that, where you'll see that they're exploring cognitive aspects of reading and literacy. On the other hand, motivation aspects are much less studied. There are few researchers, some big guns like John Guthrie, Wickfield, and Gambrell, who have studied motivation as it relates to literacy, but not that many people. So, but our population that we're most interested in, low SES, English learners in urban settings, have really been missed in the literature. So that's our focus. A little bit more about motivation and literacy. The most comprehensive model to date, and I mentioned Guthrie earlier, but he has the Corey Center, and that is that reading engagement theory. So he's created a series of instruments, one of which we used and one of which we adapted for one of our studies, and we're going to talk in detail about those instruments and how they relate to our studies in a few minutes. But reading engagement theory is really well researched, and it's a very comprehensive model. It integrates conceptual, social, strategic, and motivational dimensions. And motivational influences on English learners and urban learners have been understudied, like I mentioned earlier. It's not a focus of Guthrie's work, but he is quite interested in our work as it relates to English learners and learners in urban settings. And again, with this population, most of the focus has been on acquisition of basic skills and not looking at the role that motivation plays in reading achievement. So there are motivational theories in second language learning, but they focus mostly on adults, and they parallel but don't connect with motivational theories in other areas. So we really want to bring it to school-age children, hopefully across the school-age sort of lifespan, but we plan long-term to really focus on that as a major tenet of our research agenda. Robert's going to talk a little bit more about the reading engagement model and bring us through the first study.
It's just a word about the motivation group that we formed. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk at a conference back east, and it was on some of this work that I was doing, and I just happened to talk to somebody afterwards, and we started talking about common research interests, and it turned out that he was a faculty member at Cal State LA, so we said, why don't we get together for lunch? And about that time, I was looking for kind of a context for some of my doctoral students that had interest in this area, and so that's kind of how it started, just over a period of time. So about 9 of us now, as Gigi said, we've been meeting for about 2 years. The other, I guess, big motivation for me is if you look at the No Child Left Behind and a lot of the other initiatives, huge focus on reading over the last decade, and almost all of it focuses on the acquisition of basic skills, mainly cognitive kinds of things, which are all important, but they've really neglected the motivational dimension. So they can get really high-level, useful kinds of activities and things for kids to do, but they just neglect the motivational aspects. So you end up with a lot of kids that may or may not end up reading, but they have no interest in reading and they don't do it. The other aspect that they've neglected for the most part is teachers and what happens with the way that you implement some of the policies. So anyway, this is the reading engagement model. We typically make a distinction between motivational beliefs, which are things that a learner believes about themselves as a learner, about the tasks they're engaging in, about the importance and so forth, and then engagement, which could be cognitive, behavioral, or emotional. And both of those, motivation as well as engagement, have been linked to both achievement in general and reading in particular. So these are some of the dimensions. This is comes out of Guthrie's work, and it's probably the best empirically researched model. And this is just kind of a summary of some of the dimensions. So you can see it incorporates cognitive dimensions, emotional, motivational, and with achievement and knowledge and practices at the center. So the 4 major dimensions are social interactions, motivational beliefs, strategy use, and conceptual knowledge. And all these other factors kind of fit in. So again, this just kind of reiterates the notion that we know that the research on classrooms, there's things teachers can do in terms of how they teach, how they interact with kids, how they organize the classroom, how they mediate instruction. There's a whole series of factors that can impact student motivation and engagement. And from a teaching perspective, that's really good, because a lot of people have the notion that motivation is a trait, which is something you're born with. You either have a little bit or a lot. And if that's true, there's not much you can do as a teacher. And it's really common in urban classrooms where students don't do well for teachers just say these kids aren't motivated or the families aren't motivated. There's not much I can do to teach them. In contrast, if you think of motivation as the individual beliefs that learners have and the teaching practices can influence those, it's a much more positive kind of picture. There are certain things about that motivate the interest in looking at English learners and low SES students in urban schools. When students begin to fail, especially in reading, one of the things that happens is that they put them in remedial curriculum, they lower the expectations, they take them back to the acquisition of more basic skills, with the result that most of the materials and activities they do aren't interesting or authentic. So there's little connection to what they know and do outside of school, which is a well-established learning principle. What people like Louise Small call the funds of knowledge. So the basic idea is even the most at-risk, what people would call at-risk families and kids, are expert at something based on, just getting through everyday life. So that knowledge and skills doesn't always map easily onto what schools value, but there are ways that you can both investigate it and bring it into the curriculum and make use of it. Most of the stuff at this point doesn't attempt to do that. Low expectations and minimal challenge, which have been studies going back to the 60s from the Office of Civil Rights that documented differences in expectations and challenges that differ across racial and ethnic groups and socioeconomic classes. One of the big factors is the taking away of choice and autonomy, and this happens for both students and kids. In our own district here, where teachers are compelled to use a particular structured reading program, if you hear teachers talk about it, especially teachers that are experienced and knowledgeable, there's tremendous motivational consequences. And if you look at the numbers of teachers that leave, it's really pretty stunning. So what do we know about motivation in school kids? This is not in the domain of reading, but just in general. One of the things that we happen is kids come to school highly motivated, and as they go through the early elementary years, motivation declines. So something about the ways that we organize school gets kids less and less interested. So we have pretty good evidence for that. If you look at the area of reading in particular, you see the same pattern being replicated. If you look at both recreational reading and attitudes toward reading, you see that it is pretty positive in first grade, and by the time kids get to sixth grade, they don't really care that much. If you ask them, how much do you read outside of school, what kinds of activities do you engage in that involve reading, they decline. They, in fact, become negative, and there's some interesting gender differences where girls are a little bit more positive than boys. And I'm not sure we know the answer to why that is. We do have good evidence for the relationship between motivation and reading. Studies by Guthrie and others show that it's particularly related to reading comprehension. And one of the interesting things about reading comprehension is if you look at when kids start school in kindergarten and progress up to fourth grade, early on it's mainly the acquisition of basic skills like decoding and so forth. When kids get to fourth grade, that's when reading comprehension becomes much more prominent in the curriculum, and that's really the point at which kids begin to fail. Third grade in particular is really predictive. If kids haven't acquired basic skills by that point, that predicts achievement way down the road. But reading comprehension is a big barrier, and that third, fourth grade transition is really a critical one. So that's one that we've been especially targeting, where kids really begin to fail, even the ones that have done up so far well up to that point. So what is it about urban schools? The field in general, if you look at motivation research over the last several decades, a lot of it was developed based on college undergraduates and places like the Midwest, and people were really looking for universals, so there wasn't a lot of attention to things like culture and context. The models are relatively cultural free, and people are beginning to realize that there's actually some interesting differences between different groups of people. That people have begun to bring more of a sociocultural perspective on motivation research. It becomes more than just looking at an individual in isolation. So culture plays into the kind of motivational beliefs that people develop, what they see as important, the reason that they engage in tasks, so all those sort of things. I've said before, this is where you have schooling contexts where autonomy, choice, and engaging activities tend to be less, and motivation is really a critical feature. So our particular interest is in a group of English learners in urban settings, and that's hardly been studied at all. The little motivational research that's been done primarily focuses on African American students. There's a little bit with Asian students, some of it international in scope. So we do, one of our members of our research team did a recent study, Norm Unruh, where he found differences in motivation for Asian American and Hispanic urban middle school students. And these are some of the dimensions where, these are particular subscales of some of the measures, but there are some interesting differences, and in general, people just haven't looked at that carefully enough. One of the motivation theories has to do with differences between mastery and performance goal orientation. So do you go to school or engage in a learning task because you really want to learn more about it, or because you're compelled to do it and you want to beat out other people? So one of the things that they found is that Latino students, for example, tend to be more of on the performance goal orientation. So some of the, at the end of the presentation, I'll kind of show you like a 5-year research plan that we initially mapped out. But one of the things that we kind of started with is, what do we know about teachers and motivation? And if you look at the motivational research on teachers, there's quite a bit that's done on teachers' own motivation. Myron Dumbo, for example, has done work on teacher self-efficacy. So there's a lot of work on that, but the question we were really interested in is, what do teachers know about what motivates kids? How do teachers understand the factors in terms of their own instruction, how they organize their classrooms that impact kids' motivation? And we found nothing had really been done. So that's one of the things that we started out with. So in this, teachers' beliefs about motivation for reading, how they act on those, and another part of it, which is really our second study, the characteristics of struggling readers in urban schools. So one of the things that we did is we found that there was no measures of what our teachers believe. So we began with a well-researched measure that looks at students' own motivation, and we used that as kind of a beginning point. And that particular measure is called the Motivation for Reading Questionnaire, or the MRQ. And we spent about probably close to a year revising and piloting, and we developed what we called the TBS MRQ, Teacher Beliefs About Students' Motivation for Reading Questionnaire. And one of our first little studies was looking at the psychometric characteristics, the factor structure, reliability, and so forth. We've also done a series of focus groups, 5 or
We've done 4 so far, we have 2 more that we're gonna do.
and we're trying to get both the ways that teachers talk about their own beliefs about motivation, how they act on those in the classroom, and trying to get a more qualitative sense of things that we should be looking at. So our initial study, these are the subscales of the Motivation for Reading Questionnaire. And the study that we did, we had about 64 teachers that we looked at. And after we adjusted the items, threw out the items that weren't as reliable, or brought down the reliability, we ended up with reliabilities, which you can see on this column. And I have definitions and examples of what these different subscales mention a little bit later on, so I'll get into that. So both the focus group work and our discussions with teachers suggest that teachers' beliefs can be reliably measured. And the focus group actually kind of shows that they, the ways that they talk about motivation, although they don't have the same labels, because most of them haven't had any coursework in their teacher preparation on motivation. Most courses or most programs don't really get into that very much. Here's our second study, and I'll turn it over to Gigi.
So when we first began our talk, I talked a little bit about having our students as researchers, and in fact, we really did that. And this is really exciting to me. Although when we first started Study 2, it wasn't really a study, so we kind of jumped in to decide it would be a study. When we started to think about the reading clinic, let me just give you a little context. We had, for the first time ever, a reading clinic with one of the neighborhood large charters down the street from USC, who's been working with USC in a variety of capacities over several years. And we decided that we had a practice experience, an early field experience in our teacher prep program for MAT. And since I had been teaching Eugenia Mora-Flores and I in that program and Amy Ardell for quite some time, we thought that rather than just give them the conventional teach a couple of lessons, get your feet wet in the classroom, we would do something a little more dramatic. And it was kind of fed by the work that our Michael group had been doing over the last year. And when we started to look deeply at the beliefs of teachers, we wanted to really think about what does it mean for students. So we decided to design a study where our teacher candidates would be researchers. They aren't, of course, analyzing data in the statistical sense, but they did get their practice informed by the assessment that they conducted. So we really want to look at motivational factors for struggling readers, and we looked at a variety of measures for student data across several grade levels, which I'll mention in just a minute. And we were really wondering whether there were subgroups of readers that could be distinguished based on motivational factors. So that's sort of where our focus was for this second study. In terms of context, there were 84 Rossier MAT teacher candidates that participated, and they were involved in a 7-week reading intervention program. And it was an urban reading clinic, and we used a diagnostic teaching focus, sort of guided by the work by Barbara Walker. There were 237 urban 1st through 6th grade struggling readers, and they were identified by their teachers in their regular classroom during the year. So by spring, we had our population as having very low CST scores. So either below basic or far below basic in terms of the criterion. Many of them were English learners, so what we did was design an intervention that would work in tandem with a training effort that we provide in the MAT. So the students would learn in the classroom, our university classrooms, theoretical perspectives, delivery of assessment measures, and then go out and try it. And then Eugenia and I and Amy and three doctoral students from the TEMS and Ed Psych concentrations were in the field with them, supervising them. Our doctoral student, June, was one of them. We're out there every single day to see how they were doing. They weren't evaluating so much as guiding them and doing some sort of anticipatory guidance of helping the students. So our MAT students were involved in one-on-one or very small group tutoring after they delivered a very comprehensive set of assessments. And my mindset as the former director of teacher ed was, I wanted students in our MAT program to have in their head that you don't do any instruction unless you do assessment, and that you understand what the child needs are before you go and decide to deliver instruction. And I need to say that only anecdotally, but in fact in looking at some of the student teaching experiences that the students have had fall and spring, they have that mindset now. So not only did it serve a research purpose, but it served a practice purpose in terms of informing our students. Now this presentation isn't on all 237 kiddos, because we found that some of the measures we delivered for the younger children, if their reading ability was really quite low, we certainly couldn't include them in some of the measures like the MRQ, where they had to do a lot of reading independently. So we designed the assessment protocol based on the needs of the students. So this particular study is on a subset of the data collected with, actually it should be 111, sorry that's a typo. 111, very different than 11, but 111 3rd through 6th grade students that were struggling readers. So all of them came to the table as a struggling reader. We asked a few questions, and here are our research questions. We wanted to know if there were discernible motivational profiles among low SES struggling readers in grades 3rd through 6th in urban classrooms. But let us just also tell you that all of the students in our study were from either had free or reduced lunch. So every student was a low SES kiddo. Were there differences in reading achievement across the motivational profile? So we wanted to explore that. And then we wanted to know that did motivation to read decline from grades 3rd through 6th, because the literature had informed us that that was a trend. And if a decline was revealed, did decline vary by gender? Because as Robert mentioned earlier, there are gender differences showing up in some of the research on reading motivation for learners. So here's a couple of the measures we used. Let me just also say that we used huge numbers of measures in terms of helping the students to learn how to do that to inform their practice. But this study focuses on primarily 2 main measures in addition to the motivation to read questionnaire. So 2 achievement-related measures were the Gates-McGinnity. That test has been used widely in comprehension and motivation research related to reading. It has 2 sub-tests, including vocabulary and comprehension. And then we used the qualitative reading inventory version 4, and for that we looked at corrected reading fluency. So those are our 3 achievement measures. And then the motivation to read questionnaire that we've been talking about quite a bit in the last 30 minutes or so, because that's Guthrie's measure of reading motivation for children, and that's the measure that we also use to adapt to create a scale for teachers. And we hope to look at the relationship of reading achievement competencies and students' reading motivation. Here are some characteristics about our students, and you'll notice that our sample size isn't huge. One of the reasons it's not is when you do research with children and with teachers in training, it gets a little messy. As they're learning, things sometimes don't turn out quite as scientifically sound. But we thought it was important to have that training effort become a part of our program, because we are a research university with a teacher prep program. So additionally, our smallest group was the 3rd grade group, and you might guess why that's the case. The motivation measure, which is our primary measure, is one that you have to read yourself. So for those learners in 3rd grade that had significant challenges in reading independently, they couldn't take that measure. So we had to eliminate them for this part of the study. And we had mixed gender there. So this slide just kind of shows a little bit about the mean reading achievement scores across grades using the 3 sub-measures. So 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and 6th grade, vocabulary, comprehension, and fluency. And you can see what we had, if you look at the standard deviation, some kids showed up, believe it or not, at or above grade level, in spite of not doing well on the CST. For those of us that are educators, we know that that happens. All you have to do is not feel well when they do that kind of assessment, and you wouldn't do well. But on the whole, our readers were below grade level if you look across. The fluency measure is important to note. This fluency measure is based on words per minute that is corrected. So it's analyzed as a function of the kinds and types of errors that the students have. And there's a huge range in what's grade appropriate. And what I can tell you about the reading fluency scores is that the students generally fell in line with their reading level. So they're not so much their grade level, but their reading level. So so that we can say that the fluency measure relatively was close to where they were in terms of comprehension, not so much for vocabulary. We ran the MRQ. These scales kind of look familiar, don't they, the names of the subscales? Because they're really similar to the instrument that we adapted from the MRQ, for the teacher scale. And we have some mixed reliability. You know, at first I was really disappointed about these stats. But then I began to review the research from other researchers and found that no matter what you do, you have to, there's a balance between item number and reliability for children. You can't have a measure that has, 80 items, or they'll just fall apart and not finish it. So that's, so reliability scores the alpha values aren't so high in some situations, but there they match some of other research that's been done. The samples are important for us to look at because it gives you a feel for what the students were asked. So you can also look at the relative level of reading in terms of what was required of them in terms of understanding it. And just so you know, Robert mentioned earlier the teacher scale. We tried to align the items for the teacher scale with the student scale. He'll probably talk about that at the end of the study when we go on. These are our MANOVA results related to gender and grade and comparisons on motivation. And so what do all these numbers mean? For those of you the statistician, this is really important for you to notice. But let me talk to you a little bit about it. Basically, we see an effect in grade for gender, and there are in grade rather, and there are grade and gender interactions, but not an effect for gender. So there were grade, specific to the subscales, there were grade differences in terms of social, compliance, involvement, and grade subscales. And curiosity was the only subscale where there was an interaction between grade and gender, which is really important. In terms of grade-specific subscales, the fourth graders differed on challenge, compliance, involvement in grades. The third through fifth grade comparisons differed on grade. Fourth and fifth grade comparisons differed on social and involvement, and the fourth and sixth grade comparisons differed on efficacy and social. This is important for us to note when we think about what we did next in the study, which is what Robert's going to talk a little bit about.
One of our questions was, in what looks to be like a homogeneous group of struggling readers, are there subgroups that you can identify based on motivational profiles? And initially we had wanted to do a latent class analysis, which is probably the best way to do it if you have a number of subjects you need, because it tells you empirically how to decide how many clusters. And we weren't able to do that because we found out that not all the kids had the same measures. So by the time we got down to the sample size that we ended up with, we tried to do a K-means cluster analysis, which is a different approach. This stuff is really hot off the press, so we haven't, these are really preliminary labels, and we need to really go back and by hot off the press, I mean hot. The paper is still warm. So.
We're just finishing our analyses, and it's really interesting because what we really want to do, all of us in our group, is look closely at these clusters in terms of a qualitative description of what does it mean for those particular set of kids that fall within a cluster. And so, but we haven't gotten there yet. We'll get there by AERA, but we're not there right now.
The preliminary, I mean, we gave names high, medium, 1 and 2, and then low. But the 4-factor solution seemed to be the best way to go. And for some reason, we couldn't find the table with actual means on the subscales, but these are the centroids, which is kind of the statistical center of the cluster. And you kind of get a sense of how the groups differ. So, for example, group 4, which is a low group, and group 3, you can definitely see some high-low differences. The others, I think we just haven't had time to do it, to plot out the actual means on the subscales of the MRQ and see what the differences are. And the obvious reason for wanting to do this is whether or not there's instructional implications of the different groups. But the other interesting thing is we did an analysis of variance looking at the 4 groups, and the one area where difference emerged was in reading comprehension, which is not in vocabulary, not in the total score, not in fluency, but reading comprehension. And I was quite surprised because we have very small numbers, but it does look like there's some within group differentiation, and it relates to reading comprehension. So anyway, the stuff we're talking about today is part of a larger set of things that we hope to do that I'll describe in a second. But one thing is, I think in this school we just haven't made enough use of our teacher training program. I think there's a lot of ways that we can probably do that for both the benefit of the school and the teachers and the students.
Because if we have them working on this now, when they leave us, they'll have that mindset still. And we will, in terms of impact on the field, it would be great. Or the potential is great.
We did find that the general decline in motivation to read that other people have found in the research, so that seems to be an invariant characteristic, at least with this group of students. It looks like there's people just have these sort of general labels like at risk or struggling readers, but it looks like if you begin to look at motivation in a more differentiated way, that there's subgroups and they may have some instructional implications for, ways to intervene. The differences may be related to reading outcomes, at least in this small study, and again, the numbers are very small, but comprehension may be one of the correlates. The big sort of message I take away from this is that right now there's a real imbalance, if you look at how people are approaching reading, between an emphasis on the acquisition of basic skills and the affective and emotional pieces. And so I really think we need to think about what's good from a cognitive perspective, but also how does that impact students emotionally and affectively, and how do teachers get the skills in order to deal with student beliefs, things like self-efficacy and providing the right amount of challenge and all the other things that can impact motivation. So this is kind of it's not really a path model, but it kind of is a map that I put together when we started the motivation research group. The TPS-MRQ started looking at the, developing a scale, trying to get at what teachers' beliefs are. We're beginning to look at student descriptive studies. So what is it that we know about students in urban schools? What are their, motivational profiles? How does it relate to reading? Do we see some of the same patterns? So this initial study was one attempt to begin that. How do things like engagement and resilience relate to some of these things? What do exemplary cases look like? We want to do more work on teacher descriptive studies. The first study begins to get at teachers' beliefs, but one of the things that the research on teacher belief shows is that a lot of times what teachers say isn't what they actually do. So you have to go into classrooms and actually observe and begin to get a differentiated sense of how the best teachers work with students and produce better outcomes with the seemingly same group of students. There's this whole other aspect. One of the students in our group has done a dissertation on parent and home influences. How do those impact motivation? How can schools make use of that? One of the things that I wanted to do in our research group was get a close connection with one or more school districts. So we've developed some good relationships. And one of the things I'm really glad I did was invite a member of a school district to be a part of our team. So Ann Nemiroff, who's a director of instructional services from Montebello School District, joined our team and has been coming for about the last year. And she's actually been involved in helping us collect data and arrange to help get us subjects and so forth. So the idea is to establish kind of a long-term collaborative relationship, and on a regular basis she kind of feeds in information about what's happening at the school district, what are some of the concerns, what are the on the street word from teachers about what are things that are important to look at. So that's been a really good addition. And several of us are interested in, once we have a better figure of what all these other circles are about, looking at teacher professional development. And for that we really want to work with some districts that we have in mind. The ultimate thing is trying to devise some kind of a intervention program that takes into account all the things that we've been looking at. That would include a teacher component that would focus on the problem area for students' reading comprehension, which is about grade 4, which is where they begin to have trouble, and then integrate the cognitive and motivational and affective dimensions all at the same time. And I think probably right now we don't know enough about these students. We have some preliminary stuff just based on the small studies that we've done. So that's about where we are in the work. So I guess maybe
It would be good if you gave us some feedback and ideas about next steps, what you might be interested in knowing about from our group, etc.
Helen? Aaron?
Can you go back to the results of the study? I want to make sure I actually understand exactly what you found and how the different results relationships. So back more. So even back more when you were looking by grade at, well, first so we started at the beginning. So we were looking by grade at the kinds of motivational constructs in which the kids tended to differ, right? And it looked like, just as a first pass, is this the slide? No, it was even before this, I think. No.
That's the first set,
Yeah, so it goes up, okay, so it's gonna be, there's one where, you said that here we go. So the grade 3 to 4, they differed on challenge, compliance, involvement, grades. It seems like, and then you get into more, by grade 4 and 5, they differ on social and involvement, and then they start to differ on efficacy and social. It seems like that sort of mirrors a developmental trajectory of
Right.
representational capacity in that
Right.
those age groups, right? So I wonder if that might be one handle into trying to understand how it is that the motivational constructs change across the ages.
right.
What might look like decreased motivation in 6th graders, for instance, might truly be decreased motivation, but it might be a shift in the way the kids can express their
Well, I was thinking about
motivation.
that, we recently just got this
Yeah.
data, and when I think about that, if you look at their social context,
Yeah.
for a 5th and a 6th grader in particular,
Yeah.
that whole, the emotive piece and that whole shift from how do I express myself if I do? You know
Right,
what I
right,
mean?
exactly.
And so there may be some way to tease more of that out using something else. I think about some of the work that Dennis used to do about, creativity, emotion, maybe there might be something there too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then when you derive the clusters from the data in any cluster analysis, was there any, what was the breakdown in the clusters of the ages of the kids? Did there tend to be more of a particular age group in one or the other of the clusters?
Grade level?
we looked at-
Yeah,
We haven't looked at that. We need to we haven't looked at that.
Okay.
Now, we have an N for each cluster and they vary greatly. I don't think that slide is there, is it? No.
It's not.
So it'd be cool to just plot the kids by their grade level and the cluster that they fell in and see
Right.
if the different
Yeah.
kids fall into different clusters. That'd be-
Well, because that looks at a different feature. What we were looking at is their ability, their grade achievement, which
And
is
how it
different.
relates to
Like
their-
their, grade equivalent
Yeah.
and how it relates to that. So their achievement data. But it might be interesting to look at their human development data, so to speak, another overlay to see okay, what we know about emerging adolescents at grade
Yeah.
5 and 6.
Yeah.
How does that, what role does that play?
Right, yeah, so you could even, this is steps ahead, but just as an example, you could even use a different kind of a construct, one that doesn't involve reading,
No.
right? Like something like, I don't know if you've heard of the Stealth and Relationships interview, it's by Kennedy,
Yeah.
especially, right? So it's an interview where kids talk about their relationships and their perception of themselves in relation to other people that are close to them, their best friend, their mother, their whoever.
Mhm.
And they sort of pictorially depict it on centers of, most important to least important. And look at you could do an analysis of the complexity with which they represent their social relationships, and then see if that has any relationship to the way that they understand their own motivation.
Mhm.
And then you might get another handle into why it is that they're motivated or unmotivated, like the nature of the motivational construct in different groups of
Right.
kids or different ages.
I think we're gonna have the ability to go back into these with the same kids this summer, so we'll have, more.
We designed the
data
study as a 3-year study with the
Oh,
school.
perfect.
And so we're just hoping that if everything goes well with the MAT and the numbers of students, because quite honestly, you need a lot of bodies, not just kids.
Oh, yeah, I know.
You need a lot of teacher candidates
Yeah.
to do all this.
Yeah.
But we hope that will happen again this summer and hopefully for one more year, because that will give us, a larger, a broader, more of a longitudinal data set, and we could add those measures in. The other piece that we didn't show you because we haven't analyzed it yet is the reading interest and activity. So in other words, how does that relate to their motivation? What kinds of things are they interested in? Things like that. There's been a couple of instruments that have been designed that we also deliver to the students. So that is another piece that we're kind of interested in. But this overlay of the developmental piece is very intriguing, and I hadn't really thought about it. Like real time when I was talking today about that piece, I was thinking, well, they're almost adolescents.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
part of it. We get these ahas as we relook at the data, which is really interesting.
Some of these things are just really sensitive to the sort of classroom environment. We don't have that picture yet, like the competition and grades and recognition. If you're in a highly performance-oriented kind of classroom, then you begin to develop, more of a performance
Right.
orientation. As you become a worse reader through the grades, your self-efficacy is probably going to fall. So there's some predictable things. And
But
begin
even
to
if you look
avoid-
at the centroids across and you look at the subscales, you can see some interesting things going on. For example, look at this. You can see some interesting changes that take place. So then if you add the achievement data in, that would be interesting too. But if we also added the grade level data in, we might get a different picture. sure as well.
Or you could do grade level, you could also do which classroom the kids are in.
Right.
You know, maybe by grade, you know, maybe you find, oh, all Mrs. Johnson's kids kind of are focused on this aspect, and then Mr. Smith's kids are, you know.
And we got a feel for that a little bit when we did our focus groups. Also the teacher measure, TBSMRQ, is that what we're calling it? We just changed the name. Because it sounded like we were measuring the teacher's motivation instead of the kid's motivation, which is interesting. But anyway, when we did the focus groups, we started to feel a bit of that, where they would talk about pizza parties and different kinds of things, where we knew that some of the activities that they explained for motivating kids related more to mastery versus performance orientation.
The first thing that comes up when you talk to teachers in motivation, it's always extrinsic reinforcement.
Right.
You know, pizza, prizes, and
Stars
but then
on
if
the
you
board.
begin to talk to them more, you get them more differentiated. They actually do take into account, like some of them talk about getting kids with a home run book, which is that one book that really gets a kid excited. And so some of them spend an inordinate amount of time trying to find that one book that's going to do it. And so they don't necessarily have the labels for the, you know, the same things that we're talking about, but the best teachers seem to have an intuitive sense of that motivation is
do.
important and certain practices that they've found.
And they actually talk about real life exemplars that get to that, where we just had a focus group last week, and one of the teachers, quite a veteran teacher, she said, if I just get excited about a book, and even if I dramatize it, I just put that book down on my desk and the next day it's gone. The kids take it. They take it because, whoa, if she's interested in it, I might be interested in it. So there's a lot of different things that, you know, are different. It's nice to have the breadth of a survey. It's nice to have the depth of really digging deep and observing teachers and talking with them in focus groups and things like that.
You know, you just gave me another idea when you said that, is that you could adapt something like the self and relationships interview so that you look at kids' views and beliefs about reading. You just take a subset, say like a couple of prototypical kids from each of the clusters, and then a couple of teachers, and you could do it and look at how they actually understand the relationship between reading and the rest of their life, and see if there are sort of qualitative differences in the ways that.
I just did a recent review. I just finished it. One of the things that turns out to be really important for some students is teacher-student relationship is kind of a mediator for these things. So even though kids have maybe unchallenging classrooms or uninteresting activities, the quality of the teacher relationship with the student may mediate some of that and influence some of these things. So that's another dimension we haven't really looked at yet. It turns out with African American students that turns out to be a really important factor. So it's still up in the air.
Yes, that brings me to my question. I was wondering if you had thought about how ethnicity and stereotypes impact the fragility of competence when it comes to motivation, and how stereotypical beliefs in teachers and students either add or detract to the motivation that's present in the environment.
We actually are very interested in that, Udogo. Unfortunately, our group of students were a really homogenous group, almost all Latino. I could give you the breakdown. In fact, when we get our paper done, if you're interested in it, send us an email and we'll send it to you. But it isn't a heterogeneous group, so we couldn't really look statistically at gender in a meaningful way.
It
I mean, I'm
influences
sorry,
a lot of
it
the,
wasn't a meaningful
Ethnicity,
way.
because it was mostly a Latino population.
Yeah, in a meaningful way. It was difficult because our study was designed with a quantitative focus, but that is really something important to explore.
Where that tends to show up is like the teacher's level of challenge that she sets for the kids. So when teachers have negative stereotypes and they reduce the challenge and become more, provide kids with less autonomy. So a lot of times if you go into a classroom for the gifted in a remedial class,
Yeah, you'll
it's just
see
180
huge
degrees in
difference.
terms of how it's structured and organized. A lot of that has to do with the teacher, the stereotype.
Right. The stereotype that the teacher holds about the students that they are in fact
Right.
instructing. Right.
But it'd be interesting to we talk a little bit about classrooms and things like that to dig deeper and get a broader group. This is our first step.
Absolutely.
And, but we didn't have diverse ethnicity in terms of numbers.
Thank you.
We hope to do that. That was one of our original research questions, but when we really looked at the population.
I was just wondering if it would help to also look at maybe teachers' own reading habits and their attitudes towards reading, and like how much reading do they do, non-academic? And also, I think that's like one challenge, I think, to reading studies, because academic reading is, I think, separate than, kids reading for their own pleasure, like cartoons and stuff. So, I thought maybe like.
For the students, we actually do have more data. We haven't analyzed it.
Mhm.
And so, but we do have a reading activity inventory for the younger kids. We have a reading interest survey. So that will add that dimension, because it really looks at what kind of movies do you watch, what do you read for pleasure, what do you read with your sisters, what do you, those kind of different things.
Mhm.
And that will give us that sort of qualitative dimension.
Yeah.
For the
That gets
teachers,
at kind
we
of the
haven't.
distinction I've written about a little between what I call reading and literacy.
Yeah.
So reading is kind of the individual cognitive processes of
Mhm.
decoding text, but literacy has to do a lot more with the social and cultural beliefs about why reading is important,
Mhm.
what you would use it for outside of school,
Yeah.
and how it serves as a tool for politics and, all the other things. So, all the set of beliefs about where literacy fits in the world. And that's a lot harder to develop, so it's not that hard to get kids to be able to decode text, but developing kids into active readers and have a real appreciation for how reading and writing fit into.
Yeah, that's what I thought, like, if teachers can also take the role of being role models, because a lot of times kids with low SEN, they don't have that role modeling at home, because, parents are busy working, they don't have time.
Actually, the biggest thing in terms of SES differences is access to print, because we have good evidence that there's huge differences
Mhm.
between communities that can be right next to each other and the number of books that kids have available.
Yeah.
And now the libraries are closed for the most part in schools, so, it's something about on the order of 300 times greater, let's say, between Compton and Beverly Hills. And so if these kids don't get books and good models for academic reading in the classroom, they don't get it.
Yeah.
Other kids do okay because they have it in other places.
Was there like questionnaire or some type of involvement by the parents in terms to see what was the role that the parents played, how did the parents influence the students' read or motivation?
No,
We have a separate dissertation that one of my students did that gets at that, but. we
In
haven't
our
looked at it.
study, we didn't do that, although there are there's some questions on the reading activity inventory that somewhat relate to that, but we didn't. The parents actually are very interested in the study, so we may think about that next year. I have to just tell you a little anecdote about when we went through IRB and then I brought the study to the parents. We had 100% participation of the parents. Nobody said no. And they sat there and now they're emailing me and wanting to know if the clinic's coming back next summer. I mean, they were so excited to come. And I was, concerned because you get that IRB thing that talks about can your child be audio taped, can your child be videotaped? Their children were audio taped and videotaped because for some of the measures that we do around fluency and miscue analysis, where we want to look at the type of reading errors they're going to make, you need at a minimum an audio recording. But additionally, we have some, I didn't put it in these slides, but we have some video footage of some of the students working with our students, and it was pretty powerful, really, really powerful.
The one study, Gustavo Loera, who was an EDD student that's a member of our group, did a study. And one of the things he found was that parental involvement predicted, it wasn't whether or not they went to school meetings, but what it was that they actually did with the kids at home. And a lot of times when schools index, parent participations, did you show up to meetings and how often did you come to the school? And he found that wasn't really predictive at all. It's more what the interactions they have with kids at home about things like homework. So.
And just so you know, each of the students completed a reading profile of each of their children that they worked with. And so we've got this huge data set, but lots of information for the teachers too. And about, where the students are and things like that.
Okay, I'm a total layperson on all this. A lot of what you said is just like, academics to me. So I did come to Mary Helen's presentation on cognitive a couple weeks ago, and what I'm trying to understand is if there is a correlation going on between the behavioral motivation and the cognitive in terms of doing some testing in both and trying to kind of analyze kids as sort of a holistic case, and then try to associate your research. In other words, how the kids learn is more like the brain, and then how all these other things surface in. Is your research going in that direction too?
We've been talking.
We've been trying to connect, and even today, real time, we're trying to connect. I mean, these things make sense to us in terms of looking at all of that. And, you know, I think there is a way that we can connect those things. There is some brand new research in the Journal of Scientific Studies of Reading that kind of tries to connect that.
I think Mary Helen will be the first one to tell you that what a lot of schools are doing is way beyond, going way beyond what we know or should be saying about the available research, but we've been in conversations and have plans to develop studies that do that.
I'm not
But it just
certain we'll
seems
bring the
like-
fMRI
Yeah, it
over
just
to the
seems
school,
like
but you
to
know.
me, some people
Might do
are
something.
readers and some people process different ways, and I think some of it's just the way their brain.
But I think, I mean, at least from the motivational literature, just because you know how to do something doesn't mean you do it, so that's, motivation is really the critical part, and it really mediates, even though you have the skills to read, doesn't mean you're gonna wanna do it, or exert effort and, choose to do it when you don't have to. So.
And persist in that so you can really move forward.
I guess we're out of time, so thank you for coming.
Thank you.